I never thought my retirement in the quiet neighborhood of Asheville, North Carolina, would involve police investigations, ultraviolet forensics, and a middle-aged woman with an irrational vendetta against Firewood. But here I was, standing in my driveway on a freezing January morning, staring at the empty spot where 2 cords of seasoned oak had been stacked just yesterday. My name is Frank Olson, and I moved to the Pinewood Estates development 3 years ago after selling my construction business in Charlotte. The mountains called to me, promising peaceful days by the wood stove and quiet evenings watching the Blue Ridge peaks turn purple at sunset. What I did not anticipate was Patricia Carmichael, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association, who treated every minor infraction like a federal offense and every neighbor like a potential criminal. The firewood had been expensive, nearly $800 for premium seasoned oak, that I had personally selected from a supplier in Black Mountain. I had spent an entire Saturday afternoon stacking it meticulously in my driveway, planning to move it to my backyard shed once I finished reinforcing the floor. The wood was special, not just because of the price, but because I had marked each log with an invisible UV reactive solution that I used in my old construction business to track materials on job sites. It was a habit from decades of dealing with theft on construction sites, and old habits die hard. I pulled out my phone and called the Asheville Police Department non-emergency line. The dispatcher sounded bored as she took my report, probably thinking this was just another neighborly dispute that would resolve itself. She promised to send an officer by later that afternoon. While I waited, I decided to do my own investigation. The tire tracks in the light dusting of snow told me that someone had backed a truck into my driveway sometime after 11 last night when I had gone to bed. The tracks were wide, suggesting a full-size pickup, and they led back toward the main road through our development. I followed them on foot, noting how they turned at every corner, eventually leading to a house 4 streets over. The house belonged to Patricia Carmichael herself. Her white Ford F-250 sat in the driveway, and even from the sidewalk, I could see pieces of bark scattered in the truck bed. My jaw clenched as anger rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took several photos with my phone, making sure to capture the license plate and the bark debris clearly. Patricia had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved in. She had cited me for leaving my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. She had complained about the color of my mailbox being 2 shades too dark, according to the HOA guidelines. She had even tried to fine me $300 for parking my truck on the street overnight when I had guests over for Thanksgiving. The woman thrived on control and seemed to have nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. What I could not figure out was why she would steal my firewood. Patricia lived in one of the larger homes in Pinewood Estates, a sprawling ranch-style place with pristine white siding and shutters that probably got repainted every 2 years. She had money. That much was obvious from her luxury SUV and the professional landscaping service that came by weekly. Stealing firewood made no sense unless this was some kind of power play. Officer Marcus Webb showed up around 3 in the afternoon, driving a marked patrol car that made Patricia's curtains twitch across the street from where we stood in my driveway. He was in his early 30s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that I appreciated immediately. "Mr. Olson, you reported stolen firewood?" he asked, pulling out a notepad. "2 full cords of premium oak worth about $800, I said. "Stacked right here yesterday afternoon." "Gone this morning. Any idea who might have taken it?" I showed him the photos on my phone, explaining about the tire tracks and where they led, His eyebrows rose when he saw the images of Patricia's truck. "That is Patricia Carmichael's house," he said slowly. "She is the HOA president, right?" "That is correct. We have had our differences over HOA matters, but I never thought she would resort to theft." Officer Webb walked around my driveway, examining the tire tracks himself. He took his own photos and measurements, then looked back at me thoughtfully. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Olson. Do you have any proof besides the tire tracks? There are probably a dozen white F-250s in this neighborhood." I smiled. "Actually, I do. I marked every single log with a UV reactive tracking solution. If you shine a blacklight on those logs, they will glow with my identification code." The officer's expression shifted from skeptical to interested. "You marked your firewood." Old habit from running a construction company. We had materials stolen from job sites all the time, so I started marking everything with UV ink. When I bought this firewood, I treated each log the same way. It is invisible under normal light, but under a blacklight, you will see my initials and a tracking number on every piece. Officer Webb looked impressed. "That is actually brilliant. If you are right about this and those logs are at Miss Carmichael's house, we will have solid evidence. But I need to follow proper procedure. I cannot just show up at her door with a blacklight without cause." "What if I file a formal complaint? Would that give you cause?" "It would give me reason to talk to her, but I would need her consent to search her property or her vehicle. Unless I can see the wood in plain sight and you can identify something specific about it." I thought for a moment. "The logs have a specific stacking pattern because of how the grain runs. Also, 3 of the logs have a distinctive knot pattern that looks like an eye. I took pictures of my stack yesterday before I went inside. If those same logs are at her house, that would be probable cause, wouldn't it?" Officer Webb nodded. "Let me go talk to Miss Carmichael. You stay here. If she gives me permission to look at any firewood she has, and if your logs are there, we will proceed from there." I watched as he drove the 4 streets over to Patricia's house. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Bill Henderson, who lived 2 doors down. "Saw the cop car. Everything okay?" I texted back quickly. "Firewood got stolen, following up on it." Bill's response was immediate. "Patricia." Apparently, I was not the only one who had problems with our HOA president. Bill and his wife had been cited multiple times for their flower garden extending 6 inches beyond the approved border into their lawn. The fine had been $200, which they refused to pay, leading to months of certified letters and threats of legal action. 15 minutes passed before Officer Webb returned, and this time he pulled into my driveway and got out with a grim expression. "Miss Carmichael has a large stack of firewood covered with a tarp in her backyard. She says she purchased it from a man selling wood door to door yesterday evening. She paid cash and did not get a receipt." "That is convenient," I said dryly. I asked if I could examine the wood to verify her story, and she refused, saying it was an invasion of her privacy. She also mentioned that she would be contacting her lawyer about harassment. I felt my frustration rising. So she can just steal my property and hide behind privacy rights. Officer Webb held up a hand. "I am not done. When I was standing in her backyard talking to her, I noticed bark debris that matched the type in the photos you showed me. Also, one log had rolled away from the stack, and I could clearly see a distinctive knot pattern. Does this look familiar?" He showed me a photo on his phone. The knot formation was unmistakable, the same eye-shaped pattern I had documented yesterday, one of my logs. "That is definitely one of mine," I confirmed. "I have photos to prove it. That gives me probable cause. I am going to get a search warrant. With your UV-marked logs and the photographic evidence, a judge will sign off on this quickly." Can you meet me at the magistrate's office in an hour with your evidence? I grabbed my laptop and the bottle of UV solution I had used, along with all the photos I had taken of my firewood stack. The magistrate's office was in downtown Asheville, a 20-minute drive through winding mountain roads that were still icy from last night's freeze. Magistrate Judge Helen Torres reviewed everything carefully, asking detailed questions about the UV marking solution and how it worked. I explained the chemical composition and showed her the purchase records from my construction business days. When she was satisfied that the evidence was solid, she signed the search warrant. By 6 in the evening, Officer Webb and 2 other officers returned to Patricia's house with the warrant. I stayed in my truck down the street, watching as Patricia came to her door, her face turning red when she saw the paperwork. Even from a distance, I could hear her raised voice, though I could not make out the words. The officers brought out a portable Blacklight kit from their vehicle and headed to the backyard. I could not see what was happening, but I knew exactly what they would find. Every single log in that stack would be glowing with my initials and tracking numbers under the UV light. 20 minutes later, Officer Webb emerged and walked down the street to my truck. He was trying not to smile. "Every single log lit up like a Christmas tree," he said. "Your initials, FO, and sequential numbers on each piece. Miss Carmichael is being extremely uncooperative, claiming she did not know the wood was stolen and that she is a victim here too. But the evidence is irrefutable. What happens now?" "She is being charged with larceny of property valued over $750, which makes it a Class H felony in North Carolina. She will need to appear in court. We are also loading the firewood back onto a truck to return it to you." The bark in her truck bed has been photographed and documented as additional evidence. I felt a surge of satisfaction, but also disbelief that it had come to this. She actually stole my firewood and thought she would get away with it. "People do stupid things," Officer Webb said, "especially when they think they are above the rules. I have dealt with Miss Carmichael before on neighborhood disputes. She has a pattern of behavior that suggests she believes the HOA position gives her some kind of authority over everyone else." An hour later, my firewood was back in my driveway, restacked exactly as it had been. Patricia had been formally charged and released on her own recognizance with a court date set for 3 weeks away. The entire neighborhood was buzzing with gossip by the next morning. Bill Henderson came over with coffee and wanted to hear every detail. His wife, Susan, was practically gleeful. "I hope they throw the book at her," Susan said, cupping her mug with both hands against the cold. "Do you know she tried to fine us last month because our Christmas lights were up 2 days past the approved date?" 2 days. "She is on a power trip," Bill agreed. "But this might be the thing that finally gets her removed from the HOA board." I had not thought about that angle. "Can they remove her?" The HOA bylaws allow for removal of board members if they are charged with a crime related to their position, or if they violate the ethics code. Stealing from a homeowner definitely qualifies. Word spread fast through Pinewood Estates. By that afternoon, I had received visits from 6 different neighbors, all sharing their own horror stories about Patricia. Margaret Chen from Oak Street told me about being fined for having the wrong shade of white paint on her fence. David Ramirez from Maple Drive had been cited for parking his boat in his own driveway for more than 24 hours. Linda Foster from Pine Lane had been threatened with legal action because her rose bushes grew 8 inches taller than the approved height. The pattern was clear. Patricia had been systematically bullying the neighborhood, using her HOA position as a weapon against anyone who did not conform to her rigid interpretation of the rules. The firewood theft was just the most blatant example of her abuse of power. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from Patricia's attorney, a man named Robert Galloway from a law firm in downtown Asheville. The letter claimed that I had falsely accused his client, caused her emotional distress, and damaged her reputation in the community. He threatened to sue me for defamation unless I dropped all charges and issued a public apology. I called Officer Webb immediately. "Is this even legal? Can she sue me for reporting a crime?" "She can try," he said, sounding annoyed. "But it is a SLAPP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. North Carolina has anti-SLAPP laws that protect people from frivolous lawsuits designed to intimidate them into silence. Forward me that letter. I will make sure the prosecutor knows about this intimidation tactic." I also forwarded it to my own attorney, James Morrison, who I had kept on retainer since selling my business. James was in his late 50s, sharp as a tack, and did not suffer fools gladly. "Frank, this is absurd," he said when he called me back. "She was caught red-handed with your stolen property, marked with forensic evidence, and now she is threatening you. I will draft a response that makes it clear any lawsuit will be countered with malicious prosecution claims." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for February 5th at the Buncombe County Courthouse. I arrived early, dressed in a suit and tie, carrying a folder with all my documentation. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Apparently, half the neighborhood had decided to attend, curious to see how this would play out. Patricia arrived with her attorney, Robert Galloway, who was a slender man in an expensive suit with slicked back hair. Patricia wore a conservative dress and pearls, looking every bit the respectable community leader. She did not make eye contact with me. The prosecutor was a woman named Diana Mitchell, an assistant district attorney who had reviewed all the evidence beforehand. She had called me 2 days earlier to go over my testimony and had seemed impressed with the UV marking system. Judge Raymond Foster presided over the hearing. He was an older man with gray hair and a reputation for being tough but fair. After the preliminary statements, Diana Mitchell called me to the witness stand. "Mr. Olson, please describe the events of January 7th for the court." I walked through everything methodically, purchasing the firewood, stacking it, marking it with the UV solution, discovering it missing, finding the tire tracks, and identifying my wood at Patricia's house. Diana introduced photos, receipts, and the bottle of UV solution as evidence. "And you are certain these logs are the same ones that were stolen from your property?" she asked. "Absolutely certain. Each log was marked with my initials and a unique tracking number. The Blacklight test confirmed every single piece." Robert Galloway cross-examined me aggressively, trying to suggest that I could have marked the logs after they were recovered, or that someone else could have stolen them and sold them to Patricia. But his arguments fell apart when Diana showed the time-stamped photos I had taken before the theft and the police documentation of the UV markings at Patricia's house. Officer Webb testified next, describing the investigation and the search warrant execution. He brought the Blacklight equipment into the courtroom and demonstrated on one of the logs, which had been held as evidence. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the UV light revealed my initials glowing bright blue on the wood surface. There were audible gasps from the gallery. Patricia took the stand in her own defense, and that was when things got really interesting. She claimed she had purchased the wood from a man who knocked on her door, offering firewood for sale at a discount. She said she paid $300 cash and never suspected anything was wrong. "Miss Carmichael," Deanna said during cross-examination, "why would you need to purchase firewood when your home is heated entirely by natural gas? You do not have a wood stove or fireplace." Patricia hesitated. I was planning to have a fire pit installed in the spring. But you do not have a permit application for a fire pit with the county, do you? I had not filed it yet. Deanna pressed harder. Is it not true that you have a history of conflicts with Mr. Olson over HOA matters? We have had disagreements, but that is normal in a homeowners association. Is it normal to fine him repeatedly for minor infractions while overlooking similar violations by other homeowners? Robert Galloway objected, but Judge Foster overruled him. Patricia's face was flushed. I enforce the rules fairly for everyone. Deanna pulled out a stack of documents. These are HOA violation notices issued by you over the past 2 years. 47 citations to Mr. Olson. The next highest number of citations for any single homeowner is 6. Would you call that fair enforcement? The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Patricia had no good answer. She stammered something about Mr. Olson being particularly difficult, but it sounded weak, even to my ears. Judge Foster called a recess and returned 20 minutes later with his decision. He found probable cause to proceed with the felony larceny charge and scheduled a trial date for March 15th. Patricia would remain free on bond, but was ordered to have no contact with me or any witnesses in the case. As we filed out of the courtroom, several neighbors approached me, offering support and thanking me for standing up to Patricia. Bill Henderson shook my hand firmly. You might have just liberated the whole neighborhood, he said. That evening, I received an email from the Pinewood Estates HOA Board Secretary, Michael Torres, informing me that an emergency board meeting had been called to discuss Patricia's position as president. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and all homeowners were invited to attend. Tuesday night, the community center was packed beyond capacity. Folding chairs filled every available space, and people lined the walls. The 4 other board members sat at a table in the front. Michael Torres, Secretary, Janet Wu, Treasurer, Thomas Griffin, Vice President, and Rebecca Santos, Member at Large. Patricia sat off to the side, her attorney whispering to her. Thomas Griffin called the meeting to order. He was a retired engineer in his 60s, soft-spoken but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. We are here tonight to address the criminal charges filed against our HOA president, Patricia Carmichael, and determine whether those charges warrant removal from her position per our bylaws. Robert Galloway immediately stood. My client has not been convicted of any crime. She is presumed innocent, and this proceeding is premature and potentially actionable. Janet Wu, a no-nonsense accountant, did not look impressed. Our bylaws state that board members can be removed if they are charged with crimes involving other homeowners, or if they violate the ethical standards of their position. The charges and the evidence presented in court clearly meet that threshold. The floor was opened for homeowner comments, and a line formed immediately. One by one, neighbors shared stories of Patricia's abuse of power. Margaret Chen described being fined repeatedly for violations that did not exist in the bylaws. David Ramirez presented a stack of violation notices he had received, many for things other homeowners did regularly without consequence. Linda Foster broke down in tears describing how Patricia had threatened to put a lien on her house over a disputed $50 fine. The pattern was damning. Patricia had used her position to harass, intimidate, and extort neighbors for years. The firewood theft was simply the most egregious and provable example of her behavior. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I moved to this neighborhood seeking peace and community. Instead, I found myself constantly under scrutiny, receiving citations for things that were either minor or not actual violations. When my property was stolen and I discovered it was our HOA president, I was shocked, but also realized this was part of a larger pattern of behavior. I hope the board will do the right thing and remove someone who has abused the trust placed in her. Patricia finally spoke, her voice shaking with anger. This is a witch hunt. I have dedicated years to this community, keeping property values high and maintaining standards. If people do not like being held accountable to the rules they agreed to when they bought their homes, that is their problem, not mine. Rebecca Santos, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. Patricia, I have reviewed every citation you have issued in the past 3 years. 73% of them were directed at just 10 homeowners, all of whom had disagreed with you at board meetings or questioned your decisions. That is not enforcement. That is retaliation. The vote was 4-0 with Patricia abstaining, to remove her immediately as HOA president and from the board entirely. Thomas Griffin would serve as interim president until special elections could be held. Patricia stood, her face white with fury. You will regret this. Every single one of you. I will sue this board, and I will sue this HOA for wrongful termination. Her attorney pulled her aside, speaking urgently in her ear. They left together, Patricia's heels clicking sharply against the floor. The room erupted in applause as the door closed behind them. Several neighbors approached the board to volunteer for committees to review all of Patricia's previous citations and fines. There was a sense of liberation in the air, like a weight had been lifted from the entire community. Over the next few weeks, the new interim board began unwinding Patricia's damage. They discovered she had been pocketing portions of HOA dues, falsifying expense reports, and awarding landscaping contracts to her brother-in-law's company at inflated prices. The financial irregularities alone totaled more than $30,000. Michael Torres filed a police report, and a separate investigation was opened into potential embezzlement charges. My case proceeded toward trial. Diana Mitchell offered Patricia a plea deal. Plead guilty to misdemeanor larceny, pay restitution, perform community service, and resign from any HOA positions in the future. Patricia refused, apparently believing she could win at trial despite the overwhelming evidence. The trial took place on March 15th, a cold day with scattered snow flurries that reminded me of the morning I discovered my firewood missing. The trial lasted 2 days. Diana Mitchell presented a straightforward case: photographic evidence, testimony from Officer Webb, the Blacklight demonstration, and my testimony about marking the logs. She also introduced evidence of Patricia's pattern of harassment toward me, establishing motive. Robert Galloway's defense was creative but ultimately unbelievable. He argued that someone had framed Patricia by stealing my firewood and dumping it at her house, then tipping off the police. He could not explain why this mysterious person would go through such elaborate lengths, or how they would have accessed Patricia's backyard, which was surrounded by a privacy fence. He also could not explain the bark debris in Patricia's truck bed, or why she had initially claimed to have purchased the wood from a door-to-door seller. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Patricia guilty of felony larceny. Judge Foster scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. At sentencing, Diana Mitchell requested jail time, arguing that Patricia had abused her position of trust in the community and had shown no remorse. Robert Galloway argued for probation, pointing to Patricia's lack of prior criminal record and her contributions to the community. Judge Foster split the difference. He sentenced Patricia to 12 months in jail, suspended to probation for 3 years, meaning she would not serve time if she complied with all conditions. Those conditions included paying me restitution of $800 for the firewood plus an additional $500 for my time and expenses, performing 200 hours of community service, attending theft counseling, and being permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in North Carolina. He also ordered her to write a formal apology to me and to every homeowner she had cited in the past 3 years. If she violated any condition of her probation, she would serve the full 12 months in jail. Additionally, based on the ongoing investigation into HOA fund embezzlement, the judge warned that additional charges could be forthcoming. Patricia stood silently as the judge read the sentence, her face expressionless. She had aged noticeably over the past 2 months, her hair showing gray roots and her eyes tired. The embezzlement investigation concluded in April. Forensic accountants discovered Patricia had stolen $37,000 from HOA funds over 4 years through various schemes. She was charged with multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. Facing potentially years in prison, she finally accepted a plea deal. Plead guilty to all charges, pay full restitution to the HOA, serve 18 months in minimum security prison followed by 5 years probation, and cooperate with audits of all HOA finances during her tenure. She reported to prison in early May. By then, Pinewood Estates had elected a new board, revised the bylaws to include better financial oversight and appeals processes for violations, and recovered most of the stolen funds from Patricia's assets, including forcing the sale of her house. I finally moved my firewood to my backyard shed in late March, once the floor reinforcement was complete. Every time I loaded a log into my wood stove that spring, I thought about the strange journey those logs had taken. Stolen, recovered, used as forensic evidence in 2 separate criminal cases, and finally serving their intended purpose of keeping me warm. Bill and Susan Henderson came over one evening in early May for dinner. We sat on my back deck, watching the sun set over the mountains, sipping bourbon. "Did you ever imagine it would go this far?" Susan asked. I shook my head. "When I marked that firewood, it was just an old habit. I never thought I would need to prove ownership in a criminal trial." "You did the whole neighborhood a favor," Bill said. "Patricia was poisoning this community." Now people actually smile and wave when they see each other. We have had 3 neighborhood barbecues in the past month. That would never have happened before. He was right. Pinewood Estates had transformed. The new board focused on maintaining common areas and facilitating community rather than policing minor infractions. The pool opened early for the summer season with extended hours. The tennis courts were resurfaced. New playground equipment was installed. People volunteered for committees not out of fear, but because they wanted to contribute. I ran into Officer Webb at the grocery store in June. He grinned when he saw me. "How is the firewood situation?" he asked. "All burned for the season." "But I will definitely be marking next winter's supply the same way." That UV marking thing was genius. We have actually started recommending it to construction companies and contractors as a theft prevention measure. You might have started a trend. In July, I received a letter from Patricia. It was the court-ordered apology, written on plain paper in neat handwriting. She apologized for taking my firewood and for the harassment over HOA matters. The tone was formal and stiff, clearly written to satisfy the court requirement rather than from genuine remorse. But I appreciated the closure nonetheless. The new HOA board asked me to join as a member at large in August. I declined politely, explaining that I preferred to remain an ordinary resident. I had no desire for power or authority over my neighbors. I just wanted to live peacefully, enjoy the mountains, and keep warm in winter. but I did volunteer to lead the new Neighborhood Watch Committee, using my construction experience to advise neighbors on security measures. We organized a group purchase of UV marking kits, offering them to anyone who wanted to protect their property. Dozens of residents marked everything from tools to lawn equipment to outdoor furniture. The neighborhood became remarkably theft-free. Patricia was released from prison in November after serving 15 months with time off for good behavior. I heard she moved to another state, somewhere in Florida, to live with her sister. The house that had been sold to pay restitution was bought by a young couple with 2 kids who immediately became beloved additions to the neighborhood. On the first cold night of December, I lit my wood stove with logs from the new cord I had purchased and marked. The fire crackled and popped, filling my living room with warmth and the pleasant smell of burning oak. I settled into my recliner with a book and a mug of hot chocolate, finally feeling the peace I had sought when I moved to these mountains. The entire experience had been surreal. A simple stack of firewood had exposed corruption, liberated a neighborhood, and taught me that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. The UV marking solution, something I had used for purely practical purposes in my business, had become the key piece of evidence in bringing down a petty tyrant. I got a call from a reporter at the Asheville Citizen-Times in January, wanting to do a story about the whole affair. I declined, as did most of my neighbors. We had lived through enough drama. Patricia was gone, the neighborhood was healthy, and we all wanted to move forward rather than rehash the past. But the story spread anyway through local social media and neighborhood forums. HOA boards across North Carolina started implementing stronger oversight measures and ethics policies, all trying to avoid becoming the next cautionary tale. Some communities adopted UV marking programs for common property. The case even got mentioned in a state legislative committee discussing HOA reform, though no new laws came out of it. For me, life settled into the peaceful rhythm I had always wanted. I spent my days working in my woodshop, building furniture as a hobby. I joined the local hiking club and explored trails throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains. I attended neighborhood events and enjoyed getting to know my neighbors as actual people rather than adversaries in some petty rule enforcement game. Bill Henderson and I became good friends, often meeting for breakfast at a diner in Black Mountain to discuss nothing more serious than sports and fishing. Susan started a neighborhood book club that met monthly, and I surprised myself by joining and actually enjoying it. The community garden that had been dormant for years was revived, with volunteers transforming a weedy lot into productive raised beds. On the anniversary of the Firewood theft, February 7th, several neighbors came by my house with a surprise. They had commissioned a local craftsman to create a wooden plaque with a humorous inscription. In commemoration of the Great Firewood Heist of January 2026, which reminded us that sometimes justice glows in the dark. Underneath was a small LED blacklight that made UV painted letters spelling Pinewood Estates United glow blue when activated. We mounted it in the community center, where it served as both a conversation piece and a reminder of how far we had come. New residents often asked about it, and older residents would tell the story, usually with embellishments that made it more dramatic than it actually was. I never saw Patricia again after the sentencing. Sometimes I wondered if she had learned anything from the experience, if she understood how her need for control had destroyed her life and hurt so many people. But mostly, I tried not to think about her at all. She was a closed chapter, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power in even the smallest domains. My retirement continued peacefully. I dated a woman named Carol who worked at the local library, though it did not develop into anything serious. I took up watercolor painting, discovering I had a decent eye for capturing the mountain landscapes. I volunteered at a shelter in Asheville, teaching basic carpentry skills to people trying to get back on their feet. The firewood for the following winter came from the same supplier in Black Mountain. I marked it again with UV solution, partly out of habit and partly because the routine had become oddly comforting. But this time, the wood stayed exactly where I put it, unmolested and ready to keep me warm through another mountain winter. Thomas Griffin served admirably as HOA president, approaching the role with humility and common sense. The board meetings became productive rather than combative. Decisions were made transparently, with input from homeowners. The budget was published quarterly with clear accounting. Violation notices became rare, issued only for legitimate safety concerns rather than petty aesthetic preferences. Property values in Pinewood Estates actually increased after Patricia left, contrary to her predictions. Potential buyers were attracted by the tight-knit community and reasonable HOA, rather than repelled by stories of tyrannical leadership. Houses sold quickly, usually to families who had researched the neighborhood's transformation and wanted to be part of a healthy community. I learned several valuable lessons from the whole ordeal. First, that small acts of preparation, like marking firewood with UV solution, can have unexpectedly large impacts. Second, that standing up to bullies is worth it, even when it seems easier to just comply and keep your head down. Third, that communities are stronger than any individual trying to dominate them. And finally, that sometimes the most mundane property crime can expose much deeper corruption. The UV marking solution sat on a shelf in my garage, a bottle of clear liquid that looked completely ordinary but had become legendary in the neighborhood. I occasionally loaned it to neighbors who wanted to mark their own property, always explaining the proper application technique and documentation process. Several people joked that I should market it commercially as Olson's anti-theft solution, but I had no interest in turning this into a business venture. Winter settled in fully by late January, and I burned through firewood at a steady pace. Each log went into the stove unmarked and unremarkable, transformed into heat and light and ash. It was deeply satisfying in a primal way, this conversion of solid wood into warmth and comfort. I thought about how something as simple as firewood had become the catalyst for so much change. The mountains outside my window were snow-covered and beautiful, exactly as I had imagined when I first moved here. The community around me was healthy and functional, full of actual neighbors rather than antagonists. My home was warm and comfortable, filled with furniture I had built and art I had painted. At 62 years old, I had finally found the peace I sought. Sometimes on cold nights, I would take out my phone and look at the photos from that January morning when I discovered my firewood missing. The empty space in my driveway, the tire tracks in the snow, the distinctive knot patterns on the logs. Then I would scroll to the courtroom photos, the UV light making my initials glow blue on the evidence logs. It seemed almost surreal that it had all happened, like a story someone made up rather than actual events I had lived through. But the restitution check Patricia paid, now framed on my office wall as a quirky conversation piece, proved it was real. $800 for the firewood, $500 for expenses. The memo line read court-ordered restitution in Patricia's tight handwriting. Below it hung the formal apology letter, equally stiff and formal, acknowledging wrongdoing without really accepting responsibility. I did not keep them as trophies or to gloat. They were reminders that actions have consequences, that justice sometimes works exactly as it should, and that standing up for yourself can lead to changes far beyond your own situation. Every homeowner in Pinewood Estates benefited from Patricia's removal, even though I was the only one whose property she had actually stolen. The story would occasionally resurface in unexpected ways. A cousin in Raleigh sent me a link to a Reddit thread discussing crazy HOA stories, where someone had shared a version of my experience that was mostly accurate. A true crime podcast reached out asking to feature the case, though I declined. A law professor from UNC contacted me about using the case in a class on property crimes and evidence. I agreed to that one, figuring it might help future lawyers understand forensic evidence, but mostly, life moved on. The neighborhood thrived. My firewood burned. The mountains remained beautiful and unchanging. I grew older and hopefully wiser, more patient and less angry, more content and less restless. On the second anniversary of the incident, I was invited to speak at an HOA management seminar in Charlotte. They wanted me to discuss theft prevention and community oversight. I almost declined, but decided it might help prevent other neighborhoods from experiencing what Pinewood Estates went through. I drove to Charlotte on a warm February morning, my presentation loaded on a laptop, a bottle of UV solution and a small blacklight in my bag as props. The conference room held about 70 people, mostly HOA board members and community managers from across the state. My presentation was straightforward. I explained the theft, the investigation, the forensic evidence, and the subsequent discovery of broader corruption. I demonstrated the UV marking technique and discussed how communities could implement better financial oversight and appeals processes for violations. I emphasized that HOA boards should serve communities, not rule them. During the question period, a woman raised her hand. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed and confident. "How do you prevent board members from abusing their power in the first place?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. "You cannot prevent it entirely. Power attracts people who want to control others. But you can create systems that make abuse difficult. Term limits, financial audits, appeals processes, transparent decision-making, and consequences for violations of ethics policies. Most importantly, community members need to be engaged and willing to hold their leaders accountable. If everyone just ignores HOA governance, the wrong people will fill that vacuum." Another person asked about the cost of UV marking solutions and whether it was practical for average homeowners. I explained that a bottle cost about $30 and could mark hundreds of items, making it very cost-effective for high-value property. A retired lawyer asked about the legal implications. Was there any concern that marking the wood could be considered entrapment or that it violated the thief's rights? "No," I said. "Marking your own property is completely legal. It is no different than engraving your name on tools or photographing your belongings. The UV solution is non-toxic and does not damage the wood. It is simply a way to prove ownership." The presentation went well, and several attendees approached me afterward to share their own HOA horror stories. None quite matched Patricia's level of theft and corruption, but the themes were similar. Power-hungry board members, retaliatory enforcement, lack of oversight, and communities too intimidated or apathetic to push back. I drove home that evening feeling like maybe something good had come from the whole mess. If my experience helped even a few communities avoid similar problems, then the stress and conflict had been worthwhile. Spring came to the mountains in an explosion of dogwood blossoms and wildflowers. I spent long days hiking and longer evenings on my deck, watching the sunset paint the ridges in shades of gold and purple. The firewood was gone, burned completely, leaving only ashes that I used to fertilize my small vegetable garden. In May, I attended the HOA annual meeting, now a pleasant affair rather than a contentious battle. The board presented a balanced budget, discussed plans for community improvements, and asked for volunteer input. No one received violation notices. No one was threatened or intimidated. It was boring in the best possible way. As summer approached, I started thinking about next winter's firewood. The supplier in Black Mountain had sent his annual catalog, and I ordered 3 cords this time, having gone through 2 cords faster than expected during the cold winter. When it was delivered in July, I spent a Saturday afternoon marking each log with UV solution, a ritual that had become almost meditative. Bill Henderson came over with beers and watched me work. "You know the chances of it getting stolen again are basically 0, right?" he said. "I know," I replied, carefully marking a large oak log. "But it is not really about theft prevention anymore. It is about maintaining order and being prepared. Old habits from my construction days. Plus, after everything that happened, these marks feel like signatures. This is my wood for my home to keep me warm. There is something satisfying about that." Bill nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. We sat on my deck as the sun set, drinking beer and talking about nothing important, which is really the best kind of conversation. The mountains turned dark as night fell. Somewhere in the distance, a barred owl called. The air smelled like honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass. My firewood was stacked neatly, marked and ready for winter 6 months away. My home was peaceful. My neighborhood was healthy. My retirement was finally what I had hoped it would be. And if anyone ever asked about the firewood incident, I had one hell of a story to tell, complete with forensic evidence, courtroom drama, and an ending where justice was actually served. Not many people can say that about their firewood.